Hey guys, Chris here for 207, and we are doing the week 2 images, which obviously you had 2 weeks to do. So it's our first assignment, and looking at the apples or oranges. Or tomatoes. In fact, I think we've ended up with a Tamarillo in there, but yeah, not the world's best time for oranges at the moment. Oranges, crumbs. Not the world's best time for tomatoes at the moment. There's a couple of things that I did want to mention, and that was image size. There are two of you who have made your images significantly smaller than they should be. You must be, sorry, three of you. You must be ensuring that your images are sized at 1500 pixels on the longest edge. I'm going to have a chat to Steve, who's the course coordinator, but I think you should at 207 should have the same penalties attached as we do for 203, which is if you mess up your image sizing, you lose up to 20% of your assignment mark, which is fair enough. This is 200 level, you should know what you're doing by now. This is what your client wants. You've been asked for a specific size. They're not going to be happy if you give them something that's different. So please make sure you double check them for the next week, and I will have a chat to Steve about getting sign off on that. But you guys need to be really careful that you are making sure you double check the basics. And so, anyway, so what's going to happen is I'm going to mark your assignments using the rubric, which you'll have access to on Blackboard as normal. But you'll also have this video with some extra comments on there, and I might be able to show you how to fix some of the things up that haven't quite worked, and bits and pieces like that. So yeah, let's get stuck into it, and hopefully you guys enjoy the week and learn something out of it. Right, Vivian, so you mentioned in your PDF that you were going to add product wording but unsure if it was allowed. No, it's not for this one, but if you've got questions like that, your best bet is to email me and I will get back to you. In this case, with regards to having 3 tomatoes, composition wise, yes, 3 works quite nicely because it saves that ping pong effect. You tend to look around in a circle. But in this particular instance, the top one feels a bit, ironically, top heavy. Whereas these two kind of actually talk to each other quite nicely through that stalk, and I would have tried this without that third one on there. May have worked, may not have. It's a case of trial and error on that one. In terms of your lighting, yep, it's nice softbox. You mentioned that you had sun shining on one side. You're probably quite lucky that the flash has overpowered that, because otherwise if you mix flash and sunlight you can often end up with a color cast on it, but that's not showing through in this image, so that's fine. Background, you've not got a color cast to your shadows, and there's just a little bit of shadow in there to anchor the product, so yeah, it works well. Right, Justin, so let's have a look at yours. Yours was one of the others that had an issue with how much data you've actually sent in. You've only made it 1000 pixels high. Now that's not helped by the fact that you've got what looks to be really high ISO grain in here, and a very soft focus, all of which really produce an image that, if I was your client, I would be sending you back and saying, I'm not paying for it, go and do it again. Lighting wise, you've got the basics of the light coming in from one side to give some shape, which is nice, but looking directly down on the fruit on a stem that's been broken off doesn't give you any sense of richness of the fruit or desire to particularly eat it either. The background Photoshop work, it's not great either. You've got a very hard line here and a very soft line over around the other piece, and you haven't dealt with the ISO noise. Now, normally I would be saying, look, can I actually try and help you with what's gone wrong with the original shot? and email you and ask you for your original file. Fortunately, you've actually already uploaded your original file, and I can give you a couple of hints of where things have really gone haywire in the first shot. And the biggest thing is your ISO is at 5000. The next biggest thing is your shutter speed's way up and your f-stop's way down. It should be the other way around. You don't need that shutter speed high. It wants to be as on a tripod, and therefore you're shooting as long open as you need it to be. Your f-stop needs to be up around that f16, so you've got a really nice depth of field, and your ISO wants to be as low as possible so that you're not getting this digital noise here. Combine that all together and you start to get somewhere. The piece of paper, had you actually used a totally flat piece rather than recycle bit, would have made your Photoshop job in terms of cutting things out a lot easier. And tipping the tomato back up so that it's sitting up like we'd normally expect tomatoes to be, with the attachment point to the plant going up, and preferably have one that's actually got its stems and stalks all there and attached. And think about how you can set dress this so that it's going to look appetizing as well. Things like adding that extra spray of water on. So a long way to go. I mean, you did improve what you'd done with your Photoshop work, but you really needed to just stop and go back, fix the problems that were in the original by reshooting, and then go from there. Right, Christina, let's have a look at your apple, since we're not doing a tomato. And there's some nice stuff going on here. The first thing I notice is that you're missing its stalk. That's a bit of a shame. Add the stalk into the apple and it tells a bit more of a story. The other thing you notice is you've got a reflection here. That's caused by your camera flash, which ended up firing, which is a bit of a shame. And I did check your EXIF data, it has fired, and that is definitely what's causing the issue, and it means that you've lost some of the shadowing that you could have had, and you've got a little bit of it in terms of giving the shape to the apple, but it's taken away some of that as well, which is not as good as it could have been. Background's nice and clean. There's a little touch of green reflection in that shadow, but it's not overly noisy or anything from that point of view. And you've put a nice sprinkle of water on there, and the apple from the rest of the point of view looks nice and appealing, which is good. Right, Sarah, let's have a look at this. Now, you mentioned in your comments that without the flash it was quite shadowy. I'm presuming by shadowy you mean that it was underexposed. And the reason that it's going to be underexposed is you've got a huge amount of white, and if you have a look at your EXIF data, you've got your pattern metering on, which means that the camera's taking into account everything that's in here. If you'd gone for center weighted, then it would just take into account that piece there. It would brighten up your background and deal to some of that spot weighted. Can also do the same thing, but it tends to be a little bit finicky. The other option is you could have left it at with the pattern metering mode and gone and used your exposure bias, or EV, and increased that to compensate for the exposure. But this background needs to be much brighter than it is. It's about 0.7 and a stop, and then I'd still go through and actually play with the background to actually make it pure white. But yeah, your apple was underexposed even after you'd mentioned that you'd played with your exposure compensation, but that pretty sure is stemming from your original shot. Do make sure that your monitor is calibrated, and that you can see the difference between that 0 and 5% and 95 and 100, and that she looks like a Latino person. And yeah, that means that your monitor is going to to be much closer to what I'm looking at as well. Lighting wise, it's a little bit flat, and we've got that underexposure. By flat, I mean it's not got a huge amount of shading and shape to the apple. There's a little bit of a catch and a reflection off the top here, which is nice, but it would be nice if we actually had some shape coming into the edge of the apple as well. And you've got the stalk on there, which is good for an apple, but there's a lot of wrinkles and things down in the background, and they needed to be ironed out, shall we say, whether or not you did it in post-production or normally in with probably literally with an iron before you start getting stuck into anything. Right, Casey, you mentioned in your submission that you would have liked to have a tomato with some greenery on it, and yes, you're right, the greenery would have definitely helped. There are still things that you could have done to improve the image itself. You've used a 25th of a second, which is okay. I'm presuming you're on a tripod. Certainly should be for this type of setup, and therefore you can make that longer exposure and increase your f-stop, which is going to give you greater depth of field, and allow the back end of the tomato to actually be in focus as well. There's a little bit of a pink magenta tinge to the shadow underneath, and that could have been tweaked. And from a lighting point of view, you've got some of the shadow coming in this direction, and I like what's happening with the light and reflection of the this water droplet, but your highlight here is burnt out, and it would be nice to have a little bit more shape to the light coming in from the side. The water droplet that you've added here works, but these ones here look like they're runoff rather than that they're adding to the actual story. This one here looks more like a smudge, so I think you could have done better with the application of those water droplets. And the briefing mentions things like adding a little bit of glycerin. In fact, I suspect you can get away with adding a little bit of sugar to it, just to make sure the water droplets actually bunch up and stick there. Surface tension on the fruit can cause problems, and it looks like maybe it's had some dishwashing liquid or some sort of liquid added to the surface that's just reduced that surface tension, so the water droplets aren't holding together quite as well as they could do. But yeah, when you've got 2 weeks for this type of stuff, if you're looking at it and going, darn it, wish I had the greenery, yeah, chances are that's something that needed to be done, and at this point, yeah, going back and redoing it is definitely a good option. Right, Natasha, yeah, very nicely done. You mentioned that you've made your own softbox, and yeah, you've done a really nice job of it. You've also got the identical lamps used, and obviously identical color balance, which is great. There's no color difference between the two sides of the apple, which is really nice to see. And you've produced some really nice shading to it as well, and the front isn't too dark. The stem of the apple's nice and healthy as well, and yeah, just overall very nicely done. So the only thing I'd do is crop in a little bit. You don't need all of the negative space around the outside, but that's a relatively minor thing. Right, Carolyn, let's have a look at yours. And the first thing jumps out of me is all of the rest of the trellis, the vine that the other tomatoes are usually attached to, is still there, and really pair of scissors and snip that off and just have the one tomato that you're playing with would have worked so much better, or leave the other tomatoes on the vine and go from there. The overall exposure is a little bit under. You've got fairly large patches of grey down here, white up here. It just needs a bit more balance to that, and I think that's mostly the post-production. You've also got a bit of a colour cast coming in here with a blue tinge to this side, and this one spot of presumably the highlight from the flash. And so yeah, it needs brightening up a little bit more, and knocking off that white area from this side would have been good. But yeah, my biggest challenge is the fact that you've left the rest of this trellis, or whatever we can call it, attached. And yeah, it's a pity because you've actually got quite a reasonable piece of fruit, minus that one blemish down here that could have quite easily been cloned out. Right, Levon, let's have a look at yours. The first thing that jumps out at me is the quality of your tomato isn't fantastic. It's got quite a few bumps and patches on it. I think that might just have been that it's sat maybe in the fridge too long and got too cold. It might just be that it's got bumped. But you really need to make sure that you're picking the best fruit that you can. When you're starting to do this, it's nice to see that you've got the spider, the leaflets at the top attached, and they've got a nice colour to them. Depth of field wise, you've caught the front of the fruit in focus, and it goes back not quite halfway. It would have been nicer to have the whole of the fruit in focus, and you did still have some f-stop to play with. There's a bit of a colour cast coming from the shadows underneath, and there's a bit of a shade over this side as well, which could have been changed in Photoshop. So yeah, a few bits and pieces that could have been improved in your post-production, and a little bit of choice in terms of fruit choice right at the start that would have also helped. Right, Michelle, let's have a look at your orange. And nice to see that you've got one with a stalk on. Unfortunately, the stalk is somewhat out of focus, and that's because you've used a very shallow depth of field. It's only f4.5, and yeah, good that you've focused on the front of the fruit, but it would be much better to have everything else in focus as well. Use that longer higher f-stop, give yourself the greater depth of field, and it would also solve some of the problems that you've ended up with when you've cut this out. Because you've cut it out against an edge of an image that is blurred, you end up with a very odd looking cut, in that you expect it to be soft, but it's a really hard edge to it. So yeah, be careful with that. Lighting wise, you've got some nice stuff happening with the light coming in from the side, but it needs more light on the front, and this looks like a bruise now, rather than having it looking the rest of the skin colour. If it is a bruise, then it shouldn't have been used, it should have been turned around, but I'm pretty sure it's just an issue with the lighting that's not been as well handled as it could do. You have got black spots on the fruit, and this is for an iconic thing. It's not designed to. Your brief hasn't been to be captured organic fruit, show it off in its raw state. Your brief is for perfection, and therefore you could have cloned those things out. And kept going with it, but yeah, the general overall look isn't bad, but there are things that you could have done to improve it. Right, Michael, let's have a look at yours. In terms of the choices that you made when you're taking the photo, there's a couple of things, or one particular that stands out to me that doesn't really make sense, and that is you've gone to 400 ISO and a much faster shutter speed than you need. Would have made a lot more sense to trade that off and have a slower shutter speed and a lower ISO, which would have given you more detail in the apple. It looks like you've had to hit it with some noise reduction to deal with that ISO, and so it's lacking some of the definition it could have had. In terms of the lighting, you've got that nice white background in behind, but you've also got this really heavy shadow on the ground here. In fact, it goes down to 80%-ish grey compared to the 100% white, and it wouldn't have taken a huge amount of Photoshop work to pull that out and just make it actually white the whole way around, which is a little bit of a shame, because you've not got any lighting that's blown out. The shadow underneath and behind feathers off a little bit, so it doesn't look like it's anchored in something black, and you've got a nice catch light around the edge, which is giving the fruit some shape, but without blowing out or making any other area too dark. Crop could have been tighter. You've got a lot of room on the edge that we're not using, and so you could have given me a comparatively higher resolution image, and by the time I've cropped that down to that size, what size are we cropped? We're down to 900 pixels, so you could have given me more detail just simply by cropping in and making more use of that image with the data that you've got. But other than that, it's looking nice. It's a nice crisp looking apple, which is good. Right, Leighton, yours was one of the images that was not resized correctly. You've done it at 1300. Fortunately, you've cropped in quite close, but not too close, and everything else is really high quality. So the lack of those 200 extra pixels in width is not critical, but it could have been. It would have been a really big shame had it been, because you've done a really nice job of this, cutting the tomato in half so we can actually see that freshness. Nice little spray of water on there, well exposed. There's a little bit of colour bouncing off into the shadows that maybe could have been removed, but it's reasonably clear that it's the reflected colour from the tomato, and there's no major colour casts in the light, which is good. So yeah, you've done a very nice job. Just remember to get your image sizing correct next time, please. Right, Holly, let's have a look at yours. Now, you mentioned in here that you've used tripod to presumably to deal with the fact that you're using 20th of a second. My question is, did you use a remote trigger or the 2-second timer, because it still looks like you've got some image shake in there, or camera shake. The dots that you'd expect to see on the edge being clear all the way across to this far edge aren't, and so that leads me to think that it's probably a camera shake issue. So yeah, you should have a remote 2-second timer on there for this type on your camera for this type of stuff. Make sure that you're doing that. You may also find, and you should have come across this when you are doing your lens tests in 203, which may well be at the moment, that your lens doesn't necessarily function really well at f22 because of the diffraction issue. The images start getting soft, and that might also be the problem. You mentioned about using your light from the window and some blue cellophane on there, and unfortunately you've still got some color contrast, color cast between the light coming in from this side and the light coming in from this side. Really, you want to make sure that you use the light sources that are the same, so that you can color balance it and don't have that issue. You also need to be careful when you're doing your Photoshop work. It looks like you've added some extra color in here, and you've run over the bottom here, and it's got a line underneath there. So just be careful when you're doing that work. Yes, cropping it out and dealing with the background, as it looks like you've done, to get rid of any of the previous background distractions, is a good idea, but you need to make sure that you're not introducing glitches within the Photoshop production work as well. Right, Drew, let's have a look at yours. And yeah, I like what you've done with the setup. Having one of the oranges chopped in half is a really good idea. This orange here is nicely in focus. This one here is not so much. You've used f14, which is pretty much as good as you're going to get without things starting to drop off in terms of diffraction. The next step to take this to another level would be to actually take one photo with this in focus, change the focal point to this piece of the orange, take a second one and put the two together in Photoshop where they're actually fully sharp. There's a bit more Photoshop work that needs to be done as well. You've got quite a red tinge underneath the oranges and a very green-grey tinge underneath the leaf. So there's some colour balance issue there that could be reasonably easily dealt with, and probably the best way, the easiest way of dealing with it is to actually desaturate. Let's just desaturate that one. Yeah, it is picking up some green. Now obviously that needs to be done so that you're not getting color cast losing the orange, which I'm just doing really roughly. But if you neutralize that color tone there, then it's going to really help. But make sure you do the masking a lot better than I'm doing, because it's a very quick thing to show you. And you might want to leave a little bit of colour in there anyway, but you do want to remove more of it than is left at the moment. So yeah, as I mentioned before, the set dressing works really well. Good job. Right, Rachel, if you have questions like you haven't found anything that says that you need to write anything to go with this, please email me. Don't leave the assumption up on Blackboard as part of your submission, because if the answer was yes, then I would be still marking you down for not having put it in. Fortunately, the answer is no, but if you've got questions like that, please email me and don't post them to as part of your submission in Blackboard, because it doesn't get through to me in time, and you don't have any time to do anything about it. So let's have a look at your image. I think you could have cropped in quite a bit more. You've got an awful lot of negative space around there, which is going to give you a higher quality image for your client by the time you've finished. In terms of the depth of field, that's working well. You've gone for f16 and you've got that depth of field happening there, which is good. There is a bit of a color cast or / vibrancy issue where the bottom part of the tomato looks a bit pink more than orange, more than red, and your green of your leaf is lacking a bit. Exposure wise though, you've balanced that really well. You've not got any blown out highlights there, and the water droplets on the tomato work quite nicely, so that's good. Right, and let's have a look at yours. So first things first with the crop. Rule of thirds does not work with this particular style of photography unless you've got something that's going to offset the tomato, like the spider, the leaf formation coming out the top, which can work on the thirds. As you've put it at the moment, it's just offset. Fortunately, not one of the requirements for this week. Really, from what your client's going to want is something that they can cut out and put into another image and process as they wish later. There are a couple of glitches that have happened though. I'll zoom in. I'm going to go right into 1 to 4 so you can actually see it on the video. But when you were cutting it out of the background, you've let some of that desaturation of the background slide into the edge of the tomato. I would have also tried to get rid of that pinkish tinge from underneath the tomato and turned it into a more of a light grey. When you took the photo, you've focused on the edge of the tomato, and although you've got f8, which could give you a decent depth of field, because you've used an 88mm lens, it's still a really shallow depth of field, and it's only on that far edge. You really want to bring that depth of field or the focal point somewhere closer to about here, and have it sharp from the front of the tomato right to the back. Again, with the tomato and the set dressing, it would have been really nice to actually have the leaf structure on on the tomato and something else happening with it, maybe water sprayed on to make it look nice and fresh as well. There's more to taking a shot of a tomato than just grabbing the studio lights out and taking it on a nice white background. So make sure that you're doing your research and your reading on top of just taking the photo, and sit down and do some research before you get stuck in. And if you're unsure if the research is heading in the right direction, you're more than welcome to drop me an email. Right, James, your Tamarillo. Certainly looks tasty. I really like the texture that you've brought out on this end of the Tamarillo. Its shape and pattern within the skin, definitely not bruising, which is good. Unfortunately, by the time you get to about here, the depth of field's gone, and that could have been reasonably easily fixed because you are only on f4, so just by increasing your aperture you would have solved that problem. You also need to deal with your highlights a little bit more carefully, particularly this one here. You've actually lost the detail in that highlight from the light source. Having a bright background isn't an issue in this case, but making sure that you've got the detail in the highlights from the fruit is. I do like the set dressing, little droplets of water, just enough to give it that element of freshness, and the nice green leaf to offset that as well. Again, you could get away with cropping in a bit further, and actually this is one of those times where that green leaf becomes that offset on the thirds, and it sets off the rest of the image quite nicely. Right, Michelle, let's have a look at yours. I have to remember I've got 2 or 3 Michelles, I think, this week, or this intake. That's going to make life fun. And a Michael, which is going to be a nightmare for my dyslexia, but oh well, hopefully I don't call Michael Michelle and vice versa. Anyway, let's get on with this. So in terms of your overall exposure of the fruit, that's pretty darn good actually. It's all, none of your highlights are blown out, you've got detail in there. Where things have gone a little bit skew-iff is your background. You've got a smudge of mess on whatever that edge is over here. That could have been photoshopped out, but personally I would have gone for a crop that actually got rid of it. You don't need the apple on the thirds for this type of image. You're just selling the apple. And the other thing I'd do is give yourself a bit more room down below, because at the moment the apple's rather tight to the bottom of the image, and I'd soften off the shadow on that part of the apple as well. Let's do that again, just so that the shadow itself isn't drawing your eye around and out of the image. But other than that, you've done a very nice job of it, and I like the shape and the light that you've got on the apple as well. That's working quite nicely. Right, Amy, unfortunately your one was one of those that also had the problem with the image size, but in your case it does actually matter, and it's a combination of the fact that you've got a really small image and should be over almost a third bigger, just on one dimension, but also you've used a really high ISO, and so the combination of the two means that there's not a huge amount of detail in the lemon. You've also not used a huge f-stop, which means that you've not got that depth of field there, and I think you could have pushed this a lot further in terms of your technical side of things. The lighting coming in from the side to give light to both the leaf and the lemon, I can see where you're going with that. Does mean that you've got a little bit of a shadow underneath, which I suspect is actually put in Photoshop rather than added separately, just looking at the way that the lighting's going, but I would have left that out. It doesn't need it. It doesn't need anything to sit on the white background. The idea of this is that we can extract it really easily. The idea of having the leaves on the fruit are a really good one, but you want to make sure you clean them and get rid of any of the well, bird poo potentially on it, and you also want to make sure that it's a really nice ripe piece of fruit, and in this case you've got quite a lot of green on the underside there. So there's lots of things that you could have done to improve, and some of that is in your preparation and some of it is in your technique, but yeah, there's certainly some good stuff going on there, but you need to make sure that you're nailing all those basics as well when you're dealing with this, and just double check things like image size when you submit them as well.